Russia is waging a shadow war against Germany, and most people don't even realize it's happening. From aggressive satellite flyovers to underwater sabotage and near collisions with NATO forces, Germany is being probed, tested, and threatened in ways that look eerily like pre-invasion tactics. Military insiders are sounding the alarm. Germany isn't just another NATO member. It's quickly becoming one of Russia's primary targets in Europe, and the Kremlin isn't hiding it anymore. What we're seeing now may be the early signs of something far more dangerous than cyber attacks or intelligence games. This is escalation with a purpose, and it's unfolding across land, sea, air, and even space. So let's dive into how and why Russia is targeting Germany specifically, what the short-term implications of the increased scrutiny and aggressive posturing are, and what it means for the future of Europe's security in the changing world order. Let's start with what's actually been happening in recent weeks. On September 25th, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius revealed that Russian military aircraft conducted deliberate flights over the German frigate Hamburg while it was in the Baltic Sea as part of NATO's joint exercise Neptune Strike, the third such iteration of a joint military drill for this year. According to Pistorius, the Russian aircraft approached and flew over the frigate multiple times and circled the German part of the fleet at relatively low altitudes. While there wasn't a confrontation between the German and Russian forces, Pistorius marked the event as a clear provocation, meant to incite an overreaction from Western media. And this flyover was just another phase of Russia's ongoing strategy of surveilling and testing NATO's borders and defensive posturing. Just a few days before that incident, 3 Russian MiG-31 aircraft were detected illegally entering Estonia's airspace and loitering inside for 12 minutes. Russia has been testing how far it can push the boundaries of how close it can get to NATO member countries across the entire front. In another clash between Russia and Germany, a German helicopter escorted a Russian warship through the Baltic Sea as part of a routine surveillance mission, but was targeted with flares from the military ship instead of radio communication. The incident was initially kept under wraps specifically to avoid public scrutiny and overreactions from the media and international policymakers in an effort to de-escalate the tensions, but Russia's repeated efforts make it clear that they don't seem to have the same interest in keeping the peace. And Russia's jabs at NATO's military installations go beyond interactions on the ground. Space itself has become yet another frontier for escalating tensions. Pistorius revealed that Russian and Chinese satellites, which were supposed to be in geostationary orbits, have frequently moved over the past years, often passing close or even outright shadowing German or other NATO installations on the ground. For reference, a geostationary satellite is designed to fly in an orbit that constantly points to roughly the same location on the Earth's surface. This makes its orbit highly predictable, something other space agencies take into account when launching their own satellite missions to avoid close encounters. But contrary to the expected behavior, Russian and Chinese satellites have been repeatedly accused of spying or locking on to NATO installations. In one case, military analyst Sean Bell mentioned that a Russian satellite approached within 6 miles of another country's satellite. In space terms, that's unusually close, given that these satellites move at speeds of about 2 miles per second. This has been particularly worrying for Pistorius, as China and Russia have also steadily ramped up their satellite technology. Now, Pistorius claims they can jam, blind, manipulate, or kinetically destroy satellites, and that there are no borders or continents in space. With Earth's orbit increasingly filled with satellites for both military and civilian purposes, it can become relatively easy to quietly launch a satellite into space, one designed simply to ram into others to disable vast portions of NATO's communication networks. The threat of communication cutting shouldn't be taken lightly. Since October 2023, there have been at least 11 incidents of communications cables being damaged in the Baltic that have been flagged for review and scrutiny. In the majority of cases, Chinese and Russian vessels were suspected of accidentally or purposefully dragging their anchors across the sea floor to damage the cables. The cables that stretch throughout the sea floor represent direct communications and power transfer networks spanning all 9 countries that encircle the sea. Most often, the damaged cables are in Finnish coastal waters, as that country shares the longest continuous border with Russia, and Russian ports near St. Petersburg are now one of the home bases for its Baltic Sea fleet. For Germany, the most notable such event was the cutting of the Sea Lion 1 cable between Finland and Germany, which connects Finnish telecommunications with Central Europe. Both countries' telecommunications services were partially disrupted and rerouted until the damage could be repaired 10 days later. While there is no consensus as to who caused the damage, a Chinese carrier was initially suspected and inspected for signs of Russian intelligence directives and interference. Ultimately, US intelligence presumed the cables were cut accidentally, but European officials warned that the Baltic needed to be increasingly monitored to prevent similar occurrences. In one way or another, all of these events eventually lead back to Russia on one side and Germany on the other. So let's take a look at why Russia might be targeting Germany of all countries. First, Germany went from being one of Russia's largest European economic partners to becoming the backbone of the EU's economic and geopolitical standing, in particular its efforts to curtail Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Germany and Russia enjoyed what many considered an overly cozy economic relationship. Germany imported over 55% of its natural gas from Russia, making it deeply dependent on Russian energy. German companies had invested billions in Russian markets. Former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder literally worked for Russian state energy companies after his political career. In turn, Germany leveraged the fact that it was one of the biggest contributors to the Russian economy, as oil and gas exports make up a sizable chunk of Russia's government budget, to rein in Russian aggressive posturing. Schroeder and his contemporaries believed that a trade-bound Russia would be hesitant to sever the Nord Stream oil pipeline network by declaring war on Europe. Perhaps by design, the Nord Stream pipeline would also directly prevent a confrontation with Ukraine, a reference to the problematic relationship the post-Soviet state had with both Europe and Russia at the start of the 21st century. Over the past several decades, Germany has leveraged affordable Russian oil and gas to diversify its economy and supplement its domestic energy production. The dependence, however, grew out of Germany's long-standing decision to phase out nuclear power, a policy driven by anti-nuclear movements that began in the 1970s and were reinforced after the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters. Although natural gas and nuclear energy serve distinct purposes, with gas primarily used for heating and industrial applications and nuclear power generating electricity, Germany's heavy investment in gas infrastructure left limited room for expanding alternative energy resources. Consequently, as gas supplies fluctuate, a significant gap remains, one that might have been reduced had the nuclear industry continued operating. Then came the invasion of Ukraine and everything changed. Cutting off Russian gas meant they had to find alternative supplies at premium prices. German industrial giants that had relied on cheap Russian energy suddenly faced soaring costs. The chemical, steel, and manufacturing sectors all took hits as energy prices spiked. Germany's GDP growth slowed in 2023 as the economy absorbed the shock of the energy transition and contracted by 0.3%. Then Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a Zeitenwende, which means a historic turning point, committing Germany to fundamentally restructuring its defense posture and energy policy simultaneously. Germany utilized its incredible geopolitical and economic influence in the region to spur neighboring countries to create political policies to follow suit. While the initial prognosis of the gas cutoff was devastating to the economy, postulating a GDP drop of 5% by the Bundesbank in early 2022, that never happened. Instead, Germany's industries quickly found replacements or overhauled supply lines to use less gas, with one Brookings report suggesting a net 26% decrease in gas consumption for the industry and 17% decrease for households. The German gas industry found alternative suppliers, namely from Norway, Qatar, and the US. While these eventually resulted in increased energy bills, as gas heating costs went up 74% over the past 4 years, the actual scale of the crisis was nowhere near apocalyptic, as some expected. By 2024, Russian gas imports to Germany had dropped from the aforementioned 55% to virtually zero. Germany accepted that it would have to do some economic restructuring and changed its energy policies to deepen its support for Ukraine. But Germany's response went far beyond just a revamped energy policy. It fundamentally challenged Russia's core security narrative. From Russian President Vladimir Putin's perspective, Germany's actions represent an existential threat to Russian strategic interests. Germany has become the organizing force behind European unity against Russia. Berlin coordinated EU sanctions packages, provided substantial military aid to Ukraine, and most dangerously from Moscow's view, helped forge a united NATO response that has brought previously neutral countries like Finland and Sweden into the alliance. This is precisely what Russia claims it invaded Ukraine to prevent: NATO expansion and Western unity along Russia's borders. Yet Germany's leadership has achieved exactly that outcome. NATO is more united than at any point since the Cold War. Defense spending is rising across Europe, and critically, countries on Russia's doorstep are joining the alliance specifically because of Russian aggression. For Russia, a militarized, unified, Germany-led Europe represents the nightmare scenario. During the Cold War, Germany was divided and NATO was focused on preventing Soviet expansion. Now Germany is united, practically impossible to stop economically, and increasingly willing to use military force to support allies. The country that Russia fought 2 world wars against is once again spearheading European resources against Russian interests. These efforts have only become more prominent over the past year as the new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has frequently alluded to creating hard lines against Russia, but also making Germany less dependent on US assistance and protection. To that end, Germany has been in talks about supplying long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine, using Britain and France's nuclear deterrence shields rather than America's, and framing Russia's aggression as not just a war on Ukraine, but on Europe as a whole. This explains why Russian intelligence agencies have intensified operations specifically targeting Germany. Beyond satellite shadowing and naval provocations, Russia has conducted extensive cyber operations against German infrastructure, spread disinformation that targets German politics, and allegedly engaged in sabotage operations within Germany itself. The shadow war also reflects Russian awareness of military realities. Russia currently has no hopes of confronting NATO conventionally. The Ukraine war has devastated Russian military capabilities. Equipment losses are staggering and personnel casualties exceeded 1 million in mid-2025. The Russian military that struggled to take Ukrainian cities stands no chance against NATO's combined forces. So Russia employs grey zone tactics instead, as these methods allow Russia to pressure Germany and NATO while avoiding direct conflict that Russia would inevitably lose. It also opens doors to whataboutism, allowing Russia to claim that a supposed overreaction by NATO is reason enough for an outright nuclear response based on Russia's increasingly uncertain nuclear deterrence policy. Yet these same provocations have accelerated Germany's military transformation, potentially creating the very threat Russia fears. In February 2022, Chancellor Scholz announced a special defense fund of 100 billion euros or $117 billion, completely bypassing normal budget constraints. This was the largest increase in German military spending since World War II. Additionally, Germany committed to permanently spending at least 2% of GDP on defense, meeting NATO's target for the first time since the early 1990s, a target that was finally met in 2024. But then President Donald Trump arrived on the scene and slightly changed the equation. Rather than asking for 2%, Trump suggested 5% as the new bottom line for defense expenditure, a level that even the US itself will have to reach, as it currently spends under 3%. But Germany partially agreed with Trump's plans, suggesting that it is open to increasing its contribution even more. Precisely, Berlin is most likely to abide by a compromise proposed by NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte, where it would likely increase its military budget to 3.5% of GDP, with another 1.5% invested in military-related infrastructure for international NATO operations. The implications are staggering. Germany, with Europe's largest economy, spends 2% of its GDP on defense and has already created a military budget exceeding 90 billion euros annually. That's more than Russia's official defense budget in 2021. Combined with France, the United Kingdom, and other NATO allies, European defense spending is rapidly approaching levels that dwarf Russian capabilities. And adding another 3% to that means an additional 135 billion euros or $176 billion spent on defense and infrastructure every year. Russia can't match even that additional amount, let alone the combined total yearly increases. Germany's defense posture is also fundamentally changing. Pistorius has publicly stated that Germany exists in a space neither at peace nor at war with Russia. This acknowledgement of grey zone conflict has prompted dramatic shifts in German military doctrine. Germany is strengthening territorial defense for the first time in decades. The Bundeswehr, Germany's military, is expanding troop levels, modernizing equipment, and restructuring for potential high-intensity conflict. Germany is also considering broader conscription, reversing the all-volunteer force model adopted after the Cold War. Perhaps most significantly, Germany is abandoning decades of restricted weapons export policies. Berlin now provides heavy weapons to Ukraine, including tanks, air defense systems, and long-range missiles. This marks a complete reversal from Germany's previous reluctance to export weapons to conflict zones. Indeed, only NATO discussions could previously sway them to donate to Ukraine. These changes are a direct response to Russia's shadow war activities. Every satellite shadowing incident strengthens arguments for increased space defense capabilities. Every naval provocation justifies larger naval budgets. Every cyber attack builds support for offensive cyber capabilities. Russia's grey zone tactics are inadvertently accelerating the very militarization that Moscow fears. Yet analysts also note that Russia's ability to actually threaten Germany or NATO remains extremely limited. The Russian military has struggled catastrophically in Ukraine against a country that entered the war with a fraction of NATO's capabilities. Ukraine began with obsolete Soviet equipment, limited air defenses, and no modern battle tanks. NATO, in contrast, fields advanced fighters, sophisticated air defenses, modern armor, and overwhelming technological superiority. NATO operations seem to highly suggest the combined US and Western Europe air forces would be able to exert full aerial superiority over parts of Russia. Furthermore, Russian equipment losses in Ukraine are staggering. Verified battlefield footage as documented by Oryx indicates that Russia has lost over 4,000 main battle tanks, 13,000 armored vehicles, 300 aircraft and helicopters, and over 1,000 pieces of artillery. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has been effectively neutralized by a country without a significant navy. If Russia cannot defeat Ukraine, how could it possibly threaten NATO? The economic dimension is equally important. Russia's economy, despite better-than-expected performance, remains smaller than Italy's. The country's GDP is roughly 1/15 the size of NATO's combined economy. Russia likely won't be able to sustain a conventional arms race against a unified Europe, let alone against NATO when you toss in the United States. Furthermore, Russia's demographic crisis continues to accelerate. The country is losing population rapidly due to low birth rates, high mortality, and mass emigration. The war has killed or wounded over 1 million Russian men of military age. Russia's recruitment efforts are becoming increasingly desperate, offering enormous signing bonuses. A country losing population this rapidly cannot sustain prolonged, high-intensity conflict. This raises an important question. If Russia poses a limited conventional threat, why the aggressive shadow war tactics? The answer likely lies in Russian domestic politics and Putin's personal calculus. The shadow war serves multiple purposes beyond actual military effectiveness. First, it maintains the narrative of Russia as a great power, actively challenging the West. Putin's domestic legitimacy depends on projecting strength. Satellite shadowing and naval provocations provide propaganda material, showing Russia standing up to NATO, because every such attempt is turned around as Russia being pressured by NATO's rhetoric. Second, grey zone tactics are asymmetric and relatively low cost. Russia can't match NATO conventionally, but satellite surveillance and aircraft overflights cost relatively little while generating substantial psychological and political effects. Third, the shadow war keeps European populations anxious and divided. Every provocation generates headlines about Russian threats, potentially strengthening parties that oppose aid to Ukraine or favor accommodation with Russia. If Russia can shift European political dynamics through intimidation and information operations, it achieves strategic goals without firing shots. However, history suggests another possibility. Russia's aggressive posture may not last. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia initially moved toward integration with the West. The 1990s saw Russia join the G8, pursue closer ties with NATO, and expand economic relationships with Europe. This wasn't altruism but pragmatism driven by economic necessity. Russia needed Western investment, technology, and markets. The European Union was Russia's largest export market for oil and gas, and could also pay exorbitant prices for the convenience. Even today, China demands Russia export gas at half the price that the EU used to pay before the war, and that's despite China being the world's second largest economy. Western companies brought capital and expertise that Russia desperately needed. Economic incentives pushed Russia toward cooperation despite ideological differences and historical animosities. That cooperative period ended as Russia's economy recovered, energy prices soared, and Putin consolidated authoritarian control. With money flowing from oil exports, Russia felt ready to challenge Western influence in former Soviet states, ultimately leading to the Ukraine invasion, among other reasons which we've discussed in some of our previous videos. Now Russia's economic position is deteriorating again. The shadow fleet and sanctions evasion have bought time, but structural problems are mounting. Energy revenues are declining as Europe shifts away from Russian supplies, and Western sanctions prevent Russia from exporting gas and oil at premium prices. The war economy is producing short-term growth but long-term decay as resources flow toward military production rather than civilian development. Germany and the EU have learned from previous mistakes. The EU has imposed price caps on Russian oil, limiting Russia's ability to profit even when selling to non-Western markets. Current regulations cap Russian oil at $47.60 per barrel, significantly below market prices. These caps are enforced through restrictions on insurance and shipping, making it difficult for Russia to circumvent them, even using shadow fleet tactics. More importantly, Europe is determined not to repeat the energy dependence agreements that gave Russia leverage in the first place. Even if Russia's political system changes and a more cooperative government emerges, Europe will maintain energy diversification. Germany isn't building new Russian gas pipelines. The infrastructure investments in LNG terminals and renewable energy are permanent. Future German-Russian relations, regardless of political changes in Moscow, will never return to the lopsided energy dependence of the 2010s. If Russia's economy continues to deteriorate, internal pressures may force political change. A post-Putin Russia facing economic crisis might again seek Western markets and institutions out of necessity. Europe could potentially welcome a renewed and weakened Russia, but this time without the burden of energy and resource dependency. However, that outcome requires Russia's current trajectory to continue its mounting economic problems, military failures, and loss of international standing. The shadow war against Germany and other NATO countries may actually accelerate this process because it justifies continued Western involvement and sanctions enforcement. Germany's response to Russia's shadow war has been neither panic nor appeasement but measured escalation. Berlin is strengthening defenses, supporting Ukraine, maintaining sanctions, and reinforcing the need for European unity. This approach denies Russia the psychological victory it seeks while avoiding escalation to direct conflict. The satellite shadowing and naval provocations make headlines, but they also make Germany's case for increased defense spending. Every Russian provocation strengthens arguments for military modernization. Every cyber attack builds support for offensive cyber capabilities. Every disinformation campaign justifies counter-information operations. Russia may believe it's intimidating Germany and NATO. In reality, the shadow war is providing the political justification needed for European rearmament. Germany's defense budget in 2025 exceeds what was imaginable in 2021. If Russia continues its provocations, expect further increases. The historical irony is striking. Russia invaded Ukraine partly to prevent NATO expansion and Western unity along its borders. Instead, the war has produced the largest NATO expansion in decades, unprecedented defense spending increases, and a push for both European unity and individual policies exceeding anything seen since the Cold War. Looking forward, expect Russia's shadow war against Germany to continue, but with diminishing returns. Germany is adapting to the new security environment, building resilient systems and coordinating with allies. The provocations that made headlines in 2024 will be routine by 2026 as Germany and NATO adjust. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn what exactly Germany's most sought-after weapon is, watch our video on the Taurus missiles. And to learn more about how the Ukraine war is reshaping European security, subscribe to The Military Show for daily updates.